Is it just that one?
And there's some grass, and there's that one. I've got the sun sort of coming through on that one a little bit.
Nice.
Unfortunately, my green screen's not big enough. It's not quite wide enough.
Yeah, it's okay.
You need a green screen for your green screen.
Yes.
It's good to see you, Duncan.
And you, Eric? How are you?
I'm good. I'll just be a fly on the wall today and enjoying the learning that takes place.
Yeah, that'll be me. Just sort of here to get things started.
So. I'm so grateful that you joined and that Michael joined, and I think you guys are going to be awesome at running this. So.
It'll be good.
So we got Sophia and John in here already.
I know, and John is one of our speakers at Reliable Web, so I'm excited to have him. So Dave says hi. Dave, where are you from? And David.
South Africa.
Nice. All right. And who else? We have some others. If you just joined, let us know where you're located. It's always great to see where everybody's from. Germany. So that's two of you. Sophia is in Germany as well, Lawrence. Oh, three of you. Nice.
Oh, yeah.
I love it.
I think it's probably going to be hard for us with a lot of people's names, especially in this series. And then it'll get even harder in the Australia series. But
yeah,
we need to find like the best way to say people's names without offending them.
Well, they say Orbalint.
People are pretty nice, though.
Hopefully I said that one correct. Perfect. Okay, Balint. And then Lawrence, yes, we will start promoting you. So if you actually want to be promoted to be a panelist so that we can see you and talk with you, just raise your hand and we will bring you through.
But let's get started. Looks like no one else is asking to get on. So I will share my screen and we'll kick this thing off. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Angular Community Meetup for Europe and Africa. We're happy to have you guys here. And we're excited to kick off this new meetup and try to, spread the Angular news around the world. So we want to say to start, thanks to our sponsors, Thinkster.io, ngconf and Hero Devs, because they make all this possible. So thank you to them and welcome everyone. Just some general housekeeping stuff to get started. We follow the ngconf code of conduct. So if you're not familiar with that, you can go to the ngconf's website and read that over. For the most part.
Chat too.
What was that?
It's in the chat as well.
Oh, it's in the chat too. Okay, yeah. Cool. Thanks, Brooke.
Yeah.
So take a look there. It's fairly simple things. Be respectful and don't cause problems, and you'll be pretty safe. But yeah, look it up in the chat so you're aware of exactly what it says. But this is just to help all of us be comfortable and have a good time here. So make sure you're mindful of that. Anyone can raise their hand or message that you want to be promoted to a panelist, and we'll make you a panelist. That way you can share your camera if you want or interact voice-wise. So just let us know. We want to make sure everyone's having a good time and is heard. So just let us know. We also want to promote new podcast coming out. This is not released yet, right, Eric? Okay.
Yeah, it'll be released later this month or early next month.
Oh yeah, end of June 2021. It's a new podcast focused on Angular and not necessarily focused on heavy technical stuff like a lot of the other podcasts are. This is a lot more like soft skills, what it's like being a developer, how people like say John Papa got to where they are. Just a little spoiler there for you. But it should be really fun and is a cool new take on a tech podcast where we're not just sitting around talking about the same thing everyone else is talking about. So and Eric Slack is leading that up.
Brooke too. We're co-producers.
Oh, okay. Brooke and Eric. So that's cool. So look forward to that into June. Next thing, there's a new conference coming up soon, the Reliable Web Summit. This is put together a lot by Joe Eames, I believe. And it's focused not just on Angular or not just on a framework or anything like that. It's focused on, building reliable software on the web. So pretty broad picture, but focused on, quality and best practices in making, good, stable, sites, code, all that stuff. So look forward to that as well. And it's a fairly reasonably priced conference. It's all online, so anyone can go. So take a look at that. Tonight's prizes are actually tickets to the Reliable Web Summit. So we have 3 of those. We're just going to do this kind of random selection at the end of the meetup. So 3 people will get a ticket to the Reliable Web Summit. So thank you to our sponsors for providing those. And then moving on, before each of our meetups, we want to make sure we have a section for people seeking, looking for jobs or looking for people to come work, right? So this is both people looking to find people and people looking to work somewhere. So let's just open this up for a minute. Just, you can give a pitch about yourself if you're looking for a job, or give a pitch about a company to start. I work at Inmoment, which is a company that deals with customer experience. This is improving customer experience. So we deal with, getting surveys, but also pulling data from Twitter or Instagram and things like that to help companies understand what the customers are thinking and what their experiences are like using their products, and help companies improve that experience. So that's what Inmoment does. I've worked there for going on 4 years now. And Inmoment is looking for engineers. Most of our front end is in Angular, and we're looking especially in, I think they want to get people in our, trying to remember what city it's in, but it's in the UK. But we're looking for Angular devs. They would really like to grow that office in the UK. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and I can get you started on that interview process. So that's Inmoment's looking for Angular devs. Is anyone else here looking for a job or looking for people to come work with them?
I just want to say Brian Love has arrived, so somebody promote him, please.
On it.
Throw your name into chat, or just come off mute if you're already a panelist. You can talk about yourself. You can talk about your company's hiring positions, and we've already had people get jobs through this, so it's already been successful. Hell, I've gotten a job through this, so don't be shy.
What level of developer are you looking for at Inmoment?
For the most part, we're looking for mid to senior, but I think we have space right now for some entry level as well. So it probably depends. If you make it through, if you go to the interview process and you impress us, we'll probably hire you, because they're really more focused on like your fit and what we think what you're capable of, right? So we're more concerned about that than, hey, you have, I don't know, 5 years of Angular experience or whatever.
Nice.
We have one person in the chat say, and this is from Alexander, and he says relocation from Ukraine is an option.
I don't know that they do relocation. I know they're trying to build up that office, but we do have a lot of remote workers as well. So, I mean, that could be an option too. But if you're interested, you can let me know, and I can look into exactly what they're looking for. I just know that they're looking to hire and they're hoping for people internationally. So just to build that diversity, because we have a couple developers outside of the US, US and Canada, but not a lot right now. So, but we are a worldwide organization, so it is it is nice to have people everywhere. So,
What is the best way for people to contact you, Michael?
you can contact me at my email. I'll put it in the chat here, my Inmoment email, so that.
How's it going, Brian?
It's going well. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, good to be here.
So good to hear your voice. I know you by your voice more than by your picture.
That's right. Yeah, it's fun being on the Angular show. It's really it's a joy to hang out with Aaron and Jennifer and learn from the community. It's a great podcast, and it's really a privilege to be able to meet so many people in the community and learn from them and ask questions and all of that. So it's been a wonderful experience. So I'm glad that you enjoy the podcast, Eric. It's fun.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
Well, sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just gonna say I just put my email up in the chat. So if you have interest in the Inmoment and an Inmoment job, just email me there. You can throw your resume in there, and I can. Well, once I'm off vacation, I'll go and follow those up. So
Nice.
yeah.
I know Cisco's hiring. I think we're having like a hiring freeze at the moment, but we are going to be hiring again. We were hiring a few weeks ago. So if you are looking to work at a super giant company that makes really great software and hardware and everything apparently, then like literally it's weird. Everything that I use, like my chat, Cisco made it. My internet, Cisco made it. Like everything, they made everything. So if you would love to work at a company that built a lot of things, builds a lot of things, that cares a lot about people, yeah, then you can reach out to me on Twitter. But I think we're targeting specific locations right now. We have people working in like every country, but the positions available I know about are for people in India, Canada, or United States. And I don't know why that is, but that is. So, let me know.
Cool. Anyone else have anything they want to bring up for job seeking or job opportunities? Not. Okay. Yeah, it's tricky figuring out. Oops, I don't know what I just did. It's tricky to figure out how to do these things with a single monitor on my laptop. I usually have three. Okay, so I think, let me see. Okay, yeah. So that's it for our like, general housekeeping, getting stuff out there, like, informing you, announcements, all that kind of stuff. So now we're going to get to the main program. And I'll let Duncan talk more about himself, but Duncan is one of the organizers for the meetup. We're really excited to have his support in Europe to get this thing going. So I'll let Duncan take it away, introduce himself, and get to his message for us.
Okay. I'll try and share my screen.
Yeah.
So hopefully everybody can see the screen.
You want to introduce yourself a little bit before you get started, Duncan?
Yeah, sure. As I say, my name's Duncan Faulkner. I'm a senior software developer working for a satellite communication company here in the UK. I've been doing Angular now for probably about 5 or 6 years, and now getting into doing some online training and speaking at some conferences as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. There's a bit more. I mean, my email address is on the screen. My LinkedIn there as well as my Twitter. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try answer any questions that you may have on a sort of Angular or Angular Flex layout or Angular material. They're sort of the three areas of trying to sort of focus on. So what is Angular Flex layout? And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. Angular Flex layout is an API. It's an intuitive sort of list of HTML directives, and that can be used on HTML containers, elements, instead of the traditional CSS style sheets that developers define their layouts with directly in HTML. We've got a little bit of an example there where we've got a div, and we have this flex this FX layout, and that's really sort of adds display flex and sets the direction up, so it kind of does it all in one go. So why use Angular Flex layout? Well, if you've been looking for an alternative way to write Flexbox or CSS Grid for that matter, then Angular Flex layout might be the library you've been looking for. Some of the main advantages for Angular Flex is that the library is purely TypeScript. It uses HTML markup to specify the layout configurations, a responsive API, and it can specify different layouts, sizing, visibility, viewports, and display devices. It's completely independent of Angular material, and it also includes CSS Grid, requires no external style sheets, and is written and maintained by the Angular team and the community. Setting up Angular Flex layout, we've got a couple of options. If you only really want sort of the Flexbox module, then we just import the Flex module. Or if we want the CSS Grid stuff, then we can just import the CSS Grid module. But if we import the Flex layout module, we get both the grid and the Flexbox all out of the box. So how to use Angular Flex layout? It works by dealing with sort of one row or column at a time, and rows flow across the main axis and columns on the cross axis. And then we'll just have some of the main sort of directives that are used to sort of manipulate certain sort of layout configurations. So the main one really is the flex layout, and that sets display flex on effectively in the CSS. And we'll have a look at some examples in a bit. And then setting the row or column, depending on which way you want to sort of go. And then flex layout align justifies and aligns the content and the items, so across the main axis or on the cross axis itself. And then flex layout gap sets a margin on the bottom and the right of those elements to give us spacing. Some of the elements for some of the directives for the DOM elements are FX flex is probably the main one here, when that's the grow, the shrink, and the basis itself. And then we've got a few other ones there that sets the order, sets the offset, and then does an align, and then we can do a fill as well. And we've got various values that we can assign to them. So as an example, so we have a div with a layout, so it sets the display flex and it sets the direction to be row, and then we set a layout alignment to be start and stretch. And as we can see here, the colored boxes are left aligned and they stretch the full height of the parent container. And if we change the layout to be column, the boxes go from left to right, are stretched left to right, and are the full width of the parent container. Angular Flex layout has also a set of responsive features that enable developers to easily change the UX layout for different display devices. and we'll have a look at some of them. I've got some examples in a second I'll show you. But the responsive API stuff is fairly straightforward. It's setting a breakpoint, and we're breaking on, say, extra small or medium or large, and depending on the screen width, screen size, so various screen widths and screen devices will break at different points, and the containers will sort of flex to format in that display. And then CSS Grid features smart syntactic directives that allow developers to intuitively create responsive and adaptive layouts, again using CSS Grid. So, and some of the standard sort of API for the directives for this are the GD area, and that defines the areas. And then you got the column and the row, and then we can do an align on both the row axis and the grid axis. Sorry, on the cross axis. The slight difference there with CSS Grid is that it's two-dimensional, and it's dealing with rows and columns at the same time, rather than just a row or a column like it is with Flexbox. So that's the slides. If I then just drop that down, I've got a little bit of a demo here. I can just sort of show really what it's some sort of context to what we've just sort of seen in the slides. So this is set up. I've got an HTML page here, and it's just a few divs on a page. And we've got some CSS set up, and this is Flexbox set up within the CSS section on here. And then if I drag these around, doesn't move, but so we sort of see what we got with that. And then if to do this the exact same stuff in Flexbox, sorry, in Flex Layout, I just paste in these ones here. Oops, no, paste in the right one. And just CSS. For this as well. Right. So to set the thing up, we need to set display flex and set the direction. So we've now got the boxes in this case are going across the screen. And if we put in a flex layout gap, for instance, then we get a gap between the two, or a gap between each of the boxes. And if we want to center, say, one of the contents, we can put a the FX layout line there, center, and then that lines the content of that element within the center. Okay. Just trying to think one of the other ones there, just quickly before. Yeah. Just to sort of demonstrate quickly, just the hiding of elements and how that works with that's not going to work now, is it? Yeah. So we can set up our FX hide, or there is another one called FX show, and we can hide elements based on a breakpoint. And in this case, I've set this to be less than medium, which is the LT-MD. And as I get less than medium on the screen, then the square disappeared. Number 5 disappears on there. Did I? Did I see your hand up there, Eric? Or I'm not sure how to get back to that.
Is my hand up? Sorry.
No, it's all right. I saw it just flash up, but I wasn't sure what it was. Okay.
Yeah, my Zoom's freaking out. So.
Oh, right. One of the other main ones there we have in this is the FX flex, and we can. The shorthand version is how I like to sort of view it. Is you've got three options you can put into it. So it's grow, shrink, and then the basis. And I tend to like to think of it as sort of max, min, and the preferred side. So so when some of these shrink down, probably can't see it. Shrink down so much. So if I just set this up a bit higher. Yeah, so we can see that 3 is now 3 times the size effectively as the other ones. And that will shrink is obviously set to 0, so that will shrink back to the original size. But if we change that to, and then 2, and then when we shrink, we can see, oops, if I'll just hide this out of the way. I think that's stopping it. So when we shrink slightly smaller than, maybe if I do it 3 times the size, then that might just, the resolution. So yeah, so the shrinking, so this, I've got it set on this third element here. So they all shrink more than what the other ones do. And if I change this back to being that, and then set a preferred width on here, say of 400 pixels, which might be a bit on the big side, but yeah. So that will be, in that case, that will be fixed to that point, and that will, regardless of what else happens, everything else will sort of squidge up to fit, whereas that one will stay the preferred size, and that will try and do that the most. So, yeah, I think that sort of covers a sort of like the quick sort of demo for that. So I think that's Angular Flex layout. Oh, I don't know how to get to the questions.
Yeah. I saw one in the chat for you. Do we also need the class FX child anymore?
The class FX child really was just to give the containers a bit of height and width, and some color. So it's really more than anything. That wasn't to.
Mhm.
We shouldn't really need them too much.
Yeah, the classes are not part of the Flex layout thing. That
No,
you just
it's
named
just a
those similarly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's probably yes. Perhaps I should have changed the name slightly, but yeah. Now the Angular Flex layout really literally just deals with the positioning of components and things like that on the website. So styling and style is all sort of left to Angular Material and SAS or whatever you're using to do your styling with.
It just uses those attributes, not classes.
Yeah. They're sort of directives. They're directives on the elements. What it outputs in the HTML, in the raw HTML, is a style, inline styles, effectively, and that sort of deals with the specificity of the CSS. So if you have got classes on your elements, then that will hopefully not clash and or override. But
yeah. And looks like another question from Alexander. He says, "Is there a way to manage breakpoints?"
Yes, there is a way to manage breakpoints within the Angular Flex layout. You have a media observer, and that you can set breakpoints on that media observer, and you can set things like your small, medium, large breakpoints on that as well, and that can do it within the code itself as well, rather than just doing it in the HTML like I showed there. But yeah.
Yeah, good questions.
Yeah.
Another question: how well does it work on other elements like tables?
Yeah, it works pretty. I mean, I've used it on Angular Material tables. I haven't used it on sort of HTML tables, I must admit, but it certainly works okay with Angular Material, but the table and data component there that they have, data tables. So it does work on that okay. And I can't see why it wouldn't work on HTML tables. It should work, but I have to say I've not tried it on the HTML table.
I mean, really, it'll work on anything that you would use Flex on, right? So
yeah, it should. Yeah, it should. I can't see why it shouldn't work. So yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Duncan. That was great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Our next speaker is going to be Brian Love. So Brian,
Hello.
yep, and I'll just do a quick introduction for you, and then let you take off and correct me.
Cool. No, sounds good. Go ahead. I'm looking forward to the introduction.
Brian's a software engineer and Google development expert in web technologies, and Angular. He has a passion for learning, writing, speaking, teaching, and mentoring. He regularly speaks at conferences and meetups around the country, or I guess world. This is intended as a Europe meetup. So that's cool. Brian's co-authored Why Angular for the Enterprise for O'Reilly. When he's not coding, he enjoys skiing, hiking, being outdoors. He recently launched lookout.dev, where you can find information about best practices and advice on topics ranging from TypeScript to Angular, React, Node.js, and a lot more. So,
cool.
Yeah. So this is Brian.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that introduction.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and share out my screen. Hopefully this works. Can you see my presentation?
I can see your presentation.
All right. Let me adjust this here a little bit. Cool. So for the next couple of minutes, we're going to learn about Angular template type checking. And so very glad to be here. Thank you, Eric, for putting this together. Duncan, appreciate the presentation on FX layout. That was awesome. And yeah, so now we're going to dive into kind of a little bit more specific around how template type checking works in Angular, some of the options, how we configure it, and a little bit of the nuances around that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Michael, I already introduced myself. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular. And just so we get to know each other a little bit, I thought I'd throw some pictures of myself up on here. So on the left is a hike that I did in Norway. I guess that was fall 2019. So got a chance to travel while we were still able to travel to Europe. And so that's the top of a hike. It's a really beautiful fjord behind me. I'm going to butcher the name, but it's Preiseskollen, something like that. So there's basically a sheer drop off behind me. So you can see I'm leaving a good amount of space between myself and impending doom should I take too many steps backward. And then there's a picture of my wife and I in Spain, also kind of on a similar trip. And I'm currently living in Portland, Oregon. So in the United States, that's on the top left. We call that the Pacific Northwest. And so that's where I'm currently residing today. And so what we're going to be talking about, let me get the zoom. Sometimes, I don't know if I can get this thing out of the way. Hopefully that's not blocking the slides too much. What we're going to be talking about is, I'm going to go over 5 things here, kind of broadly speaking. First, we need to mention Ivy. If you haven't heard about that, I'll quickly mention that. I want to introduce you to a research study. We're going to talk about the different modes of Angular template type checking. I'm going to walk you through an example of how that works. And then finally, we're going to look at input setter coercion. So let's kind of walk through each one of those together. Okay, so if you are not familiar with Ivy, Ivy is basically this new compilation and rendering engine. It came out in Angular version 9, so we've had it for a while now. I think actually in version 12, we're finally moving towards kind of saying goodbye to View Engine, which was the old compilation and rendering engine in Angular previous to Ivy. And the only reason why I mention Ivy is if you're not on version 9 or higher, and I hope that you are, but if you're not, then some of this new template type checking is not going to be applicable to you. So make sure you are using ng-update to stay current with Angular, and if you can be on Angular 9, 10, 11, and now 12. So let's take a look at a research study. And I thought this was a really cool study. So the name of the paper is called To Type or Not to Type, Quantifying Detectable Bugs in JavaScript. And this was done as a collaboration between Microsoft Research and the University College in London. And this particular study was focused on TypeScript, but I think that this is kind of correlates to template type checking in Angular. And what's really interesting about this study is what they did is they went out to GitHub and they looked at all the, maybe not all, but they took a sample of public JavaScript repositories. So they kind of pulled down all these repositories from GitHub. They looked at the repository and they looked at closed issues. So they examined and went through all of the closed issues, and they examined which issues could have been prevented, which regressions could have been prevented through typing, through type checking available in TypeScript. And what they found was, believe it or not, 15% of those issues should have never made it into basically a production environment or a runtime exception, would they have been using type checking. And that's a pretty cool number, because that means that 15% of issues should have never happened, and 50% of those issues could have been caught ahead of time. And I think that brings us into Angular template type checking, because when it comes to Angular template type checking with version 9 and higher, we have much finer grained control over the template type checking. And I'm going to show you how we can configure that now. So there's 3 different modes. There's basic mode, full mode, and strict mode. With basic mode, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our tsconfig.json file. And if you don't already have a section in there, you're going to add a new section called Angular compiler options. So that kind of lives as a sibling to your compiler options that's already in your TypeScript configuration. And then inside of there, you're going to add a property called full template type check. Okay, and you can look at the docs for this. They have, if you go to angular.io, you can pull up the docs. But if we set this value to false, we're going to be in the least strict mode when it comes to template type checking. And that mode is called basic mode. If we change this Boolean to true and set full template type check to true, now we're in full mode and we're going to get additional strictness. And the Angular compiler is going to kind of look deeper into our templates in order to check things and make sure everything lines up. And then finally, we get to strict mode by setting the strict templates flag to true. And notice I got rid of the full template type check. I don't need that property, that option set anymore, because the strict templates property kind of overrides that. So once we set that to true, now we're in strict mode. So with that said, let me walk you through an example and kind of really make it clear so we can understand what is the differences between these different modes and kind of how deep is the Angular compiler going to go into my templates. So I want to walk you through, this is a really simple application. What we're going to do is we're basically going to iterate over some films, maybe output a film title and these kinds of things. So just kind of like your standard to-do list, only we're going to use films. So this is what the parent component looks like. You can see that this is called app person component, and I'm going to display all of the films for a particular actor or person. In my template, I'm going to use the app films component that I've defined. And for each film, app films is going to do the iteration. I'm going to bind down into app films. I'm going to say, hey, here's all the films for this person. So I'm going to say films equal, and then I'm going to set that equal to the property films on my person object inside some magic data object that I'm getting from my backend. And then I've got an event emitter. And so I've got that output binding for films change. And I'm going to invoke the onFilmsChange method and pass along our event object. Here's what that actual component is going to look like inside of it. So here's my magical data object data, and it's got a person property. And inside of that person property, we're going to have the films. And I've typed the person property appropriately to be a person of type person. And then here's our onFilmsChange. We're expecting an array of films, and we've got a to-do here that we're going to go off and do something when the films are changed. Now let's go ahead and take a look at that child component. So this is the app films component that we just saw previously in the template of the parent component. So here I'm going to use ng container, but don't worry, I could have used a div. Don't get distracted by that. I've had a couple of people ask, well, do I have to use an ng container? No, I did that just because I don't want the kind of redundant or unnecessary div wrapper. So that could be a div, it could be any kind of element that I wanted. And we're going to use ng4 to iterate over the films that I'm getting from my input binding. So we're going to do let film of films. And then inside of my container, I'm going to output the title and the release date. And so here you can see on the film object, we've got a property called fields. And there's my title, which is going to be a string that I'm going to kind of do string interpolation and render that there. And then I have my release date. And the important part to note here is that for the release date, I'm using the built-in Angular pipe for the date. And I'm saying, hey, I want you to display the full date for this. Again, let's take a look quickly at that TypeScript. So here's my component. As we would expect, here's that input for the films property, and we're expecting an array of film objects. So that's kind of the setup. Oh, right, here's my output emitter. So I've got my event emitter, and we're emitting out an array of film objects. The important part to note is there's no any's here, right? I'm declaring and being explicit in the types for the inputs and the types for my outputs. Okay, so let's break that down and how that applies to our different modes with Angular template type checking. So first, let's take a look at this app films. We're in the parent component, all right? And we've got our app films and our template, and we're binding down to this films property. So the first thing that's going to happen is the Angular compiler is going to come through and it's going to say, okay, do we have a data property that's in my class? And so all three modes are going to check for that. If I don't have a data property, I'm going to get a build exception, right? So not a runtime exception. I'm going to get a build exception that's going to say, hey, we got a problem here. There's no data property to bind to for this film's property input binding. Further, it's going to go to the next level and say, okay, is data an object, and does that object have a person property? Again, all three modes are going to check for this. Continuing to go further, we're going to say, okay, now is data.person an object with a film's property? All three modes are going to check for this. And now this is where things get interesting, because now what we're going to do is the Angular compiler is going to go even further when you're in full and strict mode. It's going to say, okay, is that film's property actually assignable to the input? And so it's going to look at the type declaration that we have on the film's property input, and it's going to determine if they basically can be assigned, right? If those types basically match up or they overlap enough. And it's going to do this basically by using TypeScript, right? Makes sense, right? So what's going to happen underneath the hood, you don't have to worry about this, but underneath the hood, what's happening is the compiler is actually taking the template and it's parsing that template and it's using TypeScript to determine hey, can I assign these values to one another? And if not, then we can know about that ahead of time. And then further, as things get a little bit more interesting in strict mode, we can actually check the type of the $event object. So in basic and full mode, $event is basically any, right? It could be anything. And so it's any, right? And so you don't have any type checking there. But if we get to strict templates and we turn on that mode, now the compiler is going to look and assign a type to $event and make sure that we can assign that to the callback, that onFilmsChange method in our class. So pretty cool. So now let's take that maybe a little step further. Let's kind of look at our child component. So here I've got the template down below with my ng4 where I'm iterating over my films and I'm outputting the title and release date like we saw earlier. So now let's go ahead and take a look at each of the kind of basic, full, and strict mode and see what we get here. And the first thing that you notice right off the bat is basic has the gray check mark here. And there's this thing in Angular, you don't worry too much about it if you've never heard this, but everything inside of an ng4 is called an embedded view. And so prior to Angular version 9, prior to Ivy, and if you're only in basic template type checking, the embedded view is not type checked at all. So everything inside of that ng4, it is what it is. If you've got a typo in there, or you've got a problem, or you're trying to send some data to a pipe that's incorrect, you're not going to know that ahead of time during your build process. You're not going to know about that until you actually go and either in your end-to-end testing or your unit testing, or if you're manually doing testing in your browser where you're going to see that kind of runtime exception. Maybe you have a typo or fields is undefined or something like that. So in full and strict mode, that's where we're going to get type checking of our embedded view. Now, again, if we're in full and strict, what's going to happen is inside of that embedded view, we're iterating over the films, and we've got a film template variable. And for that template variable, it's going to say, okay, does that film, is a property of the film, is fields of property of the film object. And so we're going to check for that. And the compiler is going to look and say, okay, does fields exist inside a film? We're going to keep going further, and we're going to say, is film.fields an object, and does it have a title property? And so only in strict mode does it kind of go an additional level. When you're in full template type checking, it's only going to check that first level, if you will, of saying, okay, does the template variable have a property? But after that, it's not going to go any further and give you any sort of type checking during your build process. The next thing I want to show you is kind of the same thing, that release date, is that a property within fields? So just like above, in strict mode, we're going to get type checking for that. And then finally, this is the other one that's kind of interesting, is when we're in strict mode, the new compilation and rendering engine that we have in version 9 and higher, if you enable strict mode, it actually checks the typing for pipes. And so the date pipe, if you look at the transform method on the date pipe, you're going to notice that it's going to expect a string, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to check that release date property is of type string when it goes to bind that to the pipe. So you're getting really good level of template type checking when you're in strict mode. Finally, let's take a look at input setter coercion. And this one's a little odd, but let's walk through this because I do want to make sure that I point this out to you. In this example, what I have is I have a button component, and I've got a setter and a getter on a back property. And you can see that I'm expecting this back property to be of type Boolean. And so the idea here is, like, let's say I want to have like a little icon or something on my button to indicate that this is like a back button. This is just like a hypothetical example. And so here's my set. You can see I'm getting a value of type Boolean, and I'm setting it in a private member property called underscore back that's also of type Boolean. So let's look at how we might use this in our templates. So here I've got an app button component, and I want to say, hey, this is a back button, right? And so I want to use this shorthand. I could use the brackets and say back equals, and then the actual Boolean true or false, or some expression that evaluates as a Boolean value. But what I want to do is I just kind of want to have a really quick, easy solution here. I just want to be able to say back. But the problem is what you may not know, and what I didn't know at the time, is when you do that, actually what's happening kind of under the hood of Angular is it's actually still binding that to a value. It's just binding it to an empty string. And so you're going to get a exception because you're in your build process, if you're using strict template type checking, it's going to say you can't assign a string to a Boolean value. And so this is where what we want to do is we want to use input setter coercion. And so what I'm going to do is on my setter, I'm still expecting a Boolean value here, but I can also check inside of there and say, hey, if the value is equal to an empty string, and I probably should be using the double nullish coalescing operator that we have now in TypeScript, but I'm going to do my default operator here, or to the kind of default to the value. And what's important here is kind of to override the compiler is I need to have a special static property inside of my class to do type coercion and to tell the compiler, hey, it's okay if this back property is Boolean or an empty string. And so notice the static property down at the bottom of this class. You have to use this as a very specific ng accept input type underscore. So that has to be kind of the prefix. And then whatever the property is for your component, we're going to coerce that type. And I'm going to say for that back property, it can be Boolean or an empty string. So at this point, hopefully you're like, whoa, this is cool. Like, we should be on strict mode if we're not already. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do I get there? Like, what's the process, Brian? How do I go from where I am today to getting to strict mode so I can get all of these benefits and reduce regressions in my application? And so what I recommend to do is first start by turning on full mode, basically assess the level of effort, do an ng build, assess that level, and then start planning out in your sprint planning how you can get from basic to full, and then repeat that process to get to strict. So once you get to full mode, go ahead and turn on strict mode, do an ng build, assess the level of effort, the complexity, how many kind of red squiggly lines you're going to get, and then use that information, bring it back into your sprint planning process or whatever your planning process is, and then start planning out how you can get there over time. So the key takeaway with all of this is I want you to walk away with this number in mind: 15%. 15% fewer bugs, 15% fewer regressions, 15% fewer pull requests, 15% fewer issues, and maybe 15% more time to do things that you love. Maybe like go to the beach and spend some time with family. So with that, I want to say thank you. I hope this was valuable. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Brian_Love. I blog at brianflove.com, and I've got my own consulting company called LiveLoveApp.com. And I'm actually offering for you, having attended this, a free half-day Angular architecture review by a Google developer and Google developer expert in Angular. So if you're wondering what's the architecture of your application, and I've done this for Fortune 100 companies, I've done this for startups. What I do is for a half day, I'll come in, take a look at your code. We get to meet, hang out, kind of show me what your app does. I'll actually take 4 hours of my time and go through a checklist that I have to determine kind of some high-level architecture of your application, and then deliver a PDF to you within 48 hours of my findings. I also do paid architecture reviews, but this is completely free. So if you're interested in that, you can go to my website, liveloveapp.com, and I'd love to help you out if I can. And with that, thank you so much. Appreciate, Eric, the invite to be here. And it's been really fun getting to present to you all. And I will stop sharing, and we could take a look at maybe some Q&A or something like that. So let me stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Anyone can just message in here. Okay, here we go. So first question, I can be mistaken, but it looks like dollar event should be film array instead of film.
Oh, good catch. Yes, I saw that as I was presenting. I was like, oh, yeah. I would have got a build error, right?
Yeah.
If I would have tried to do ng build,
if you were doing this in
that
PowerPoint,
in strict mode. Yeah. Good catch. Yeah, that's a typo. I need to fix that. Thank you.
So you can use
Alexander.
strict mode or Alexander for
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah, nice. I like it. Cool. Lawrence, looks like we got a question. Is there any case where you should not use strict mode? So that's there's the answer to that is, I think, twofold. I think there's a technical answer to that, and there's a feasibility / business strategy answer to that. And so technically, the answer to that is you should be using strict mode. Probably similarly, you can also enable strict mode on the TypeScript compiler, and one could argue technically that you should be using strict mode there as well. However, if you've got a code base that's already not using strict mode, either with TypeScript or with Angular template type checking, the feasibility and that can be something where you have to make a business decision, right? That's where you're basically analyzing and determining, how do we get to strict mode? And are we okay with maybe end-to-end testing kind of covering us and these types of things? But there's also a business case to say, well, if we can reduce regressions by 15%, maybe there's a better argument in terms of going to strict mode. So short answer, is there when you should not use strict mode? Technically, you should be using strict mode, but feasibility wise, I understand that it can be difficult to get there. If you're starting, I would say this, if you're starting from scratch, like a greenfield application, you're planning this out, you're going to like ng new, or you're going to use nx and new up and app, absolutely start with strict mode, because then from the beginning, you can just ensure that high quality of your type checking. Let's see. Waza says, what's the behavior in the different modes with dealing with optionals, optional class members, nullables, and observable values? So that's a really great question, Waza. That's going to basically line up exactly with how you would expect if you're writing in TypeScript. Remember, as I mentioned briefly, Angular is actually compiling your templates down into TypeScript. And so that exact behavior, whatever you would expect to work in TypeScript between maybe two classes, or when you're just calling a function, or you have optional members and nullables and observables, the exact same behavior is going to line up. So is the level of strictness that you declare in your TypeScript is going to match up with the level of strictness in the template when you're in strict mode, because it is going to check everything and kind of compile it all down to TypeScript. Cool. Great question. Great questions. And thanks, Alexander. I'll update my slides, put those brackets in there. If you have any other questions, my DMs are open. You can hit me up. I'll throw it's Brian_Love on Twitter, or check out liveloveapp.com if you're interested in the free half-day architecture review. And with that, thank you so much, Michael and Eric and everybody else, and Duncan, everybody else that's been here. Very happy to be here. This has been great.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That was excellent.
Yes, very good. It's cool, really cool to see that template checking in the templates. Very cool. I love strict mode. I hate adding strict mode to things that didn't already have it.
It could be, yeah. So even on my own, like I have, personal projects where I've like enabled it, and I'm like, oh man, this is gonna be hours of work. Just,
Yeah. I've just done that myself.
Well, it's really funny because I work with a pretty fair sized team and a very large like NX repo, and it's like you're making a new app, just make it strict mode, and they're like, but then I got to use this library, and then that's got to be strict mode. I'm like, yes, that's the point.
And that is a good point. With NX, you have separate TS configs in all of your libs, so you can start. Let's say your app is big, you're going down the path of NX, and you're going to start breaking things out into like auth or utils or whatever it is. You're creating these libs. You can actually go in the TS config for those specific libraries and say, no, I'm going to start tackling this library, get it to strict mode, right? And so you can start chipping away at it that way in kind of a logical way with the NX versus not using NX, or if you just have a large app and you try to go to strict mode, it can be definitely, it can be potentially overwhelming. Let's put it that way.
Yep. And then with large teams too, it's nice to, I haven't seen this, maybe I'll put something like this together, but a like solid cheat sheet for like what to do to get your app to strict mode, right? Like, because I mean, there's some tricks around, like, oh, your inputs, right? So there's a few tricks, and I mean, I've been on so many calls with people that are like, this is how you do it, this way or whatever. And that takes up a bit of my time trying to get to strict mode, because I'm not necessarily hands in code all the time with it, but yeah,
that sounds like a great blog post.
Yeah. I'll put it on the list, right?
Yeah. No, it does in general for anybody watching or listening, and like, hey, that's a great idea to pick up and say, here's what I learned, and share it out with the community in terms of what are some steps or what are some tricks or top 5 things I learned on how to get to strict mode with Angular template type checking or something like that. Yeah. So. Love it.
Cool. Well, next thing, as I'm going to speak to you. So this is going to be very exciting for everyone. No. My name is Michael Madsen. I am lead technologist at Inmoment. What that means is basically I oversee all the front-end development and manage that. Not necessarily people management, but architecture, making sure best practices are followed, jumping in on code reviews, just a lot of that oversight and direction stuff. That's what I handle. Career-wise, I've worked in enterprise development my whole career, or what people would call enterprise development. Everyone means something else when they say that, but that's really kind of been my niche, is understanding what it means to do enterprise development. Not necessarily meaning we make code for other businesses, but following practices that make it easy to manage large code bases and large teams. And so, because I have such a passion for that, today's presentation, I gotta share my screen, is for what I call Angular in the enterprise. Star Trek themed it because it seemed appropriate, but we're gonna jump in here. It's not gonna be a ton of code, but I'm gonna talk about a bunch of concepts. And things that we do to enforce enterprise best practices. I'll touch on a lot of like topics, like little topics, and we'll just move on. I'll call out when there's other trainings that you can go to if you're interested in the topic or want to learn more about that. I'm also planning on doing more of a series about like kind of bite-sized series about, you know, standards, why they're important in enterprise and how to enforce those, and things like that as well. So that's going to be coming soon. But anyways, I'm Michael Madsen. My GitHub is MGM87, and actually that Twitter thing is not accurate. I'm actually mmadsen87, not MGM87. So I should probably fix that someday. But at mmadsen87 is my Twitter. So let's jump into Angular in the enterprise. First thing, big thing, monorepo. So this is I mean, monorepos have been around a long time. But NX has not been around that long. And the popularity of monorepos in front end has not been what it is now until NX. And that's because monorepos are only as good as their tooling. Okay. If you don't have appropriate tooling, monorepo just turns into a monolith, and people don't want that. But a big thing, enterprise development, I pitch monorepos all the time, because I mean, even managing a small set of projects, it can turn into a nightmare. For instance, I'm thinking back to Angular. Well, let's see, Angular made the CLI support libraries at like Angular, what was that, 6 or so? Maybe it was a little earlier than that. Anyway, the CLI didn't always support building libraries. So you'd see all these starter projects, everyone built libraries differently. Everyone was writing their own tooling for building Angular libraries, and it was kind of a mess. And at Inmoment, we had an app, a single Angular app, an admin app, and then they had a component library. They intended to write more apps that would use it, but right now it's just a single app and a single library. And new version of Angular is coming out, and it's like, oh, we want to get the library building with the CLI and upgrade the app and all this stuff, but there's active development going on in both of those places. And just the management of that single library and that single app and getting the upgrade out appropriately, it was very harsh. With better management, it could have been done better, but it was not pleasant. And that was one of the things I used to be like, okay, we're building this new platform. Let's use a monorepo because it's going to save us so much. And I mean, I'm upgrading, or someone is upgrading our monorepo, which has 10 or so production apps and hundreds of libraries every 6 months, and it takes maybe an hour, right? So monorepo, huge gains just from a dependency between all your code standpoint. And again, big things about monorepos, consistency. So everything is built consistently. Your libraries all live in there. Your apps all live in there. It's more maintainable because when you need to upgrade something like Angular that everything is using, or a big portion of things are using, you upgrade all the places at once, and it's very easy. And then updatable. When you update a library, this is another problem with not using monorepo, is that let's say you have a component library and you have a bug that needs to be fixed and it affects one of these apps, right? You make the change to the component library, you publish that, and then you go over to your app to start consuming this component library, and then it goes into test and everything's good and it deploys. But what if you and your QA and who else didn't realize that that component that you fixed is also used in another app that wasn't deployed, and it creates a problem in that app? Like you've deployed code into that library that's going to break another app, and no one has visibility into that's going to break, right? And so that's one thing that, again, monorepos they can help you a lot in your maintainability and stability of your code. And again, NX, this is the big name in monorepos right now, at least for Angular. And I've found it, I've used a few different monorepo projects, but NX has a big leg up on the others I've seen on a lot of levels. So if you haven't messed with NX, check it out. It makes Angular development easier than just using the CLI. Like honestly, when I'm just spinning up a single project, I still use NX because I like the tooling in NX. It just makes a lot of things a lot easier, and it's kind of awesome. So, oh shoot, guys, I'm sorry. This is one of my I was doing a Klingon presentation last week, and I missed I missed taking out the Klingon slides. Sorry about that. So here we go. So this is what a monorepo in NX looks like. You have a workspace, and that's what holds all your code. Then you have apps. So like for me, we have an admin app, a reporting app, whatever, and then we have all these libraries. But they all live under this workspace, and that's kind of how it works with a monorepo. Where if you were doing an individual thing, each of those blue boxes would be its own project that deploys individually. So let's look at some of the tooling from NX. One thing I really like is the dependency graph. So this is helpful. I use this with our QAs sometimes, and to understand just what your changes are affecting. So NX, you can create a dependency graph, and that will show you the interaction between all of your libraries and how they're used with other libraries or with what apps. So if we made a change to the form validator library and ran the dependency graph to look at the diff, it would highlight for you where things had changed. So what's helpful with this is if you have a QA that needs to validate your work and you make a change somewhere in the library, you don't necessarily have to communicate all the places that were touched by that change, because they can look in here, a QA or anyone can look in here and see, oh, the user management route in the admin app uses these form validators or whatever. But if it was something more universal, you'd see, oh, these 4 apps were affected on these routes by this change. So it kind of helps make sure that you've tested everything that is affected by your changes. So that's great. And there's a bunch of affected operations: build, dependency graph, end-to-end testing, unit testing, linting. There's more than what is listed here. But this is just so that in your CI system, you can say, hey, we just want to build the things that changed, and it'll build the 3 apps, not the 10 apps type of thing. So that is very valuable. So this has all been about basically the monorepo, but there's a lot of things that go into, another Klingon slide. There's a lot of other things that go into enterprise development. One of those things like Brian talked about with strict type checking, that is very valuable in an enterprise development situation. Another thing that's very valuable is linting. It has a lot that's similar with the strict checking. Sorry. And it, just validating that your styling looks the same, so that when you come into another library that you haven't touched before, you have a similar expectation of how the library is set up and what your standards are. NX has some very handy linting tools built in so that you can keep your dependency graph clean and help prevent yourself from making circular dependencies on libraries. So a library that depends on another library that depends on the first library type of thing. But the linting helps a ton. And if you have a good linting sheet, that's great. Some people are very passionate about what is in the linting thing. That is less important than having one, okay? So having a linter, very important. Next thing, and this is something that I've struggled with Angular, is that by default, Angular, you have an environment file, and you can build your project with different environments, right? So you make a new environment file. You can have your prod version, you can have your dev version, you can have your Europe version and Australia version, and you have to build the app separately for any of those. But that breaks several conventions and makes it difficult. Like for enterprise development, ideally, when you're going through different stages, let's say you have a dev environment, you have a staging environment, you have a prod environment. Ideally, what happens is that each of those environments, it's the same artifact that you built originally. So you build the app once and deploy each of those places, and it's validated each of those places. You don't really want an additional step that something could go wrong where you're building the app again and then testing a new artifact. Because in some cases you've invalidated some of your testing. But if you have a single artifact that you can deploy to each environment and then dynamically load any of the settings that you would have in an environment file, then you have a more stable and robust solution for testing those things. So at a high level, this is what we do. Someone commits some code into the monorepo, there's a build, but when we deploy both the build artifact and then some environment configuration. And there's ways to do this so that you don't break the internal Angular environment tooling, but you still can load in your new environment. If that's something that interests you, you can reach out to me on my Twitter. I have not written an article on this yet, but plan to in the future, because this is a pretty big question. If you once you realize this is a problem, you start looking around, you find a lot of people are making solutions for this. But it is something very important for a good, robust deployment process. Another thing that I do, there's a library called RxRS that I maintain. That stands for Reactive Responsive Design. I have done talks of this at several conferences, so you can go on YouTube and search. Well, don't search my name because there's an American actor with my name, but search for. I think you can search for Reactive Responsive Design. I also have Medium articles on the ngconf Medium publication about this, and this is a way to handle responsive layouts without using media queries in your CSS. And this leads into some other enterprise questions. So first thing, media queries I've found are a mess. There's no defined organization. And when there's no defined organization, that coding can really enforce, it makes it harder for you to enforce it as an organization, which means that you're depending more on people in code reviews to enforce things, which is not ideal. And that breaks down into sometimes people use different queries. So like your breakpoints don't match throughout apps. These are things that you run into more with like larger teams. You can only query screen width. This is changing. New versions of CSS are letting you query container widths in addition to screen widths, but that's not everywhere yet. One thing I really don't like is the components always load. So you get a smaller screen, that means you're going to get rid of items on the screen. But if you're using media queries, it's still generating those items and hiding them. It's not completely removing them, if that makes sense. And then it's also kind of hard to test. So these are some reasons that I kind of built out this RxRS thing. And it's just a way to codify what your breakpoints are for your app, and then have a unified way to apply those styles in your code. So it alleviates a lot of the maintenance that people would have to be doing through code reviews and such, because the code forces it on you. And that's one of my enterprise. that's something to keep in mind in enterprise. Anytime that you can have code enforce a standard, that's what you want to do. You don't want to be depending on people to enforce a standard. So that's what this focuses on. Again, if you're interested, look at the NGConf publication. I have some articles there, or on YouTube. I've spoken about this at several conferences. Next thing, module federation. And I'm not going to talk a bunch on this. Manfred talks about this a lot, and he's a huge proponent of it, and he has great talks about it. But module federation is a big deal. I mean, micro front ends has been a hot buzzword for years, but until we got to module federation, I mean, in my view, it was mostly just a buzzword. Like if you did domain-driven design, that's fine, but I didn't view that as a micro front end, right? But module federation is literally a micro front end where you can, for instance, our apps at Inmoment, we have 10 plus apps. They all have the profile screen. Well, that profile screen before module federation, each app, if you hit the profile, like go to my profile button, it would load up that route. But it doesn't matter how many of those apps you go to. You go to another app, you click the profile screen, it's got to download that bundle again. With module federation, that code is the same code across all of the apps. So all of the apps are sharing it, which means it's cached between the apps. So if you go to one app and hit your profile page and then go to another app and hit your profile page, that code is already going to be there and available. Which one is cool because it improves performance, but also it's nice because you know that everything is actually running on the same code. So if you see a bug in one place, there's not really a reason it wouldn't be affecting everywhere else. So I mean, just from a standard standpoint, that's really cool. And from a deployment standpoint, build time standpoint, there's a lot of gains that you get from that through developer productivity and whatnot. So that about wraps it up for what I wanted to talk about for enterprise development today. We can open it up to questions now. Stop sharing my screen. Tried to start a new share instead of the same one. Here we go. Oh. Eric wants me to make him a panelist. Apparently he quit. Where is he? Oh, there he is.
Maybe he had to run.
Yeah. Okay. Eric's back. Yeah, and thanks for calling that out. We do have Manfred speaking here soon. Yeah, next month.
July, yes. Yeah. All about module federation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Manfred is great because there's a lot of things that I'll be like, man, this is really good. I really wish someone would focus on this because I don't have time to write about it. And then Manfred will be like, bam. He's done that like multiple times to me. I'm like, this guy, he's on my page.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait just a minute, see if anyone has any questions. Brian, do you have any thoughts on, enterprise development that you would add to anything I said?
No, I thought you did a really great job. I mean, I think you covered a lot of it. I don't think I have a whole lot there to add. I think moving to monorepo can be good. There are constraints, of course, but you have to, that's kind of intentional. The only thing I would add around the NX thing is one of my favorite features of NX that I think kind of goes unnoticed is the tagging feature. And so you can use specific tagging in your NX.json file. And it's imposing additional constraints, right? And so basically saying this library can only be used by these applications or these kinds of things. So that way you really are starting to maybe constrain in terms of the dependencies between your applications and your libraries, or between libraries and libraries. And that can avoid some of your circular dependencies, or maybe some just, VS Code or WebStorm does an import of something out of an admin lib that you should be bringing into a non-admin based end-to-end test or application. And basically NX will cry foul through. I think you have to add an ESLint configuration, basically.
Yeah, there's an extra ESLint lib that pulls that in. But we use those extensively. They are very handy. And that's the thing, like we say, it adds additional constraints, but when you're working with larger teams and what I classify as enterprise development, like you want constraints, right? And so that's one of the things that I'm like, oh, the monorepo is great because it enforces more constraints, because as long as you have, like I said, code enforcing the constraints, that means people don't have to enforce the constraints, right?
Correct.
And and like that's the whole thing, is that you want a bigger team, but you don't want additional work, right? So the way you do that is by enforcing things through code. That's a similar thing. Like I have a hard time with React because it has so few constraints, right? Like that's what people pitch is like the good thing about it, but I'm like, but I work with a lot of large teams and I don't want to have to worry about that, right? And it's a lot easier to be like, oh, Angular set up a bunch of guide rails for everyone, and so that means I don't have to worry about nearly as much. So just kind of same sort of concept there. And what Alexander said, how do you keep all that in mind? That's his only question. And I think that comes down to you let the code do it, right? So you find a good hit list of things that you should have enforced, and you get those things enforced, and then you don't have to think about it too much, right? Because there's a lot of stuff to keep in mind, but as long as the code's keeping it in mind for you, then you don't have to worry about it. Like the real problem comes when I have to when you have to start training new people to do PRs and be like, here's the list of like 3,000 things you need to watch out for in PRs. That's a much more difficult list from like my pre-Angular and NX days. Where now I find a good, good resource, like for instance, tagging in NX, and you apply that, and then all of a sudden a bunch of items off your checklist fall off, right? So
you can also get other people involved. So if I'm sure you're not the only smart person who works where you work. Teach some stuff and share what you learned, and maybe it even requires a formal training, and allow people to champion your causes. You're going to go a lot farther if you let others push for things that you want to accomplish, because there's just too many things and you don't have enough time to do it all. But if you're that big picture, the person who's kind of going out there and getting all the cool knowledge, like from this meetup today, then you can share with some passionate, intelligent individuals, have them push it for you.
Yeah. Yep. And that's a very good point. Buy-in in an organization is huge, and buy-in from devs helps a lot for that. Like sometimes they don't feel like they have a lot to say in an organization that's larger like that. But at the same time, people will see like, this is what people like to use, and this is what we're going to get the productivity out of. I see Waza, he asked, have you ever had to move an existing enterprise app into a monorepo? Where did you even start? So I have done that, not nearly at the scale. So like, there's a couple things. Like my current NX app or NX repo has like 10 plus published apps. Some other apps, hundreds of libraries, something like that. It's more complex to move into a monorepo. If you have like, oh, we have an app, we want to move that into a monorepo, that's probably where you want to start. And I've done that. So there's still like in my organization, even there's not full buy-in into like monorepo mentality, right? But so far as Angular goes, that's going well, and I've gotten a lot of our React work into monorepo as well. But we still haven't melded those two yet. So I'm like, okay, I want this group making these React components in a monorepo because, like, even if they're in separate monorepos, it means that our build tooling matches, right? And so that's another enterprise thing that you get out of a monorepo is that your Webpack configs match, your rollup configs match, like all those build configurations match. You don't have people just throwing stuff together and seeing what happens. And so when the React people would come to me and be like, why isn't this working? I'm like, well, I don't want to try to dissect your Webpack config, right? And so I'm like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I moved them into, also their developer process was like crazy because they had this component library and then they had like a React library and a different app that was like their testing React library that tests that component library. And then they had another library. Anyways, it was a lot of roundabout stuff going on. And I'm like, where's even the documentation to run this thing? It's nowhere. So I was like, okay, monorepo, we got the React app into the monorepo and then all their testing apps into the monorepo. So they kind of have like their own monorepo that handles their React code and then their apps that they test those libraries with. And it's separate from our monorepo, but it operates on the same tooling. So similarly, if you're trying to move a lot of stuff, just start with the thing, right? You don't have to try to bite off everything at once. You can start with an app, get the app in there. That's an easy thing to start the monorepo on, and then identify a library and be like, hey, we're going to move the library in here. We're going to set up the build tooling for libraries, right? Because that's another thing is you'll have a bunch of CI build tooling to do for this kind of stuff. And so you don't want to just be like, bite everything off at once and shut people down for a while. But yeah, you just take a bite. I would say start with an app because that's probably the easiest thing to start on. Get all that stuff set up and then start pulling in the libraries you need. And make sure they're still deploying appropriately so other parties can still consume them. But yeah, you just don't get too wrapped up in there's so much to do. You'll just do little bites. Take an app, then start working on the libraries, make sure your CI tooling is all in place. And once you have a couple libraries in there and the app in there, it'll go much faster because that's a cool thing about NX is like with those affected commands, there's not a lot of changes that have to take place as you add more things. So you got a couple libraries in there. You see both those are deploying well. It's not hard to set up your CI tooling so that it'll just detect, hey, there's another publishable app. Let's deploy that, right? So yeah, the further you go, the easier it gets with the monorepo tooling.
I would also add, I mean, if you've got a single app, there's also a migration. I think you can do ng-add at narwhal /workspace or something like that.
Yeah.
And that can help you in terms of just doing kind of a schematic space update for you to kind of lay out some of the, the config files, update your angular.json, create the nx.json file, move the app into an apps directory and these kinds of things. So it'll do some of the kind of hard, heavy lifting in the beginning. But that's one place to kind of take a look at that. If you go on the NX website, I think they've got like migrating to NX documentation that'll kind of walk you through some of that.
I think even if you go, I think that's the default way they intend NX to be used is to be adding the workspace. So I think if you just go to the get started, it will tell you like the npx command to just throw that on there. And that's one of the reasons I'd say like start with an app is because that's what it's kind of focused on. Once you have that there, you can run with it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Just imagine a world where you don't have to make packages and ship them around with 15,000 different versions of all your packages. I know you know that world because you did that back in the monolith days. And you switched to the packages days with the micro front ends, and you're like, we're micro front ends. We don't have to do this anymore. And then you had all this extra crap you had to do. At NX monorepo, you don't have to do it anymore. You can have your Angular apps build out of it itself, and no more npm packaging and pull requests just to update the version in all of your different libraries. It is beautiful, and you will not regret creating a proof of concept for this. Choose an app, just start, and you won't regret it.
Yeah. And just remember, it is placing, like Brian said, additional constraints. So, I mean, there are cases where you don't want those constraints. It's just if you're working in large apps with large teams, I would argue that the constraints are good. And like for me, I'm familiar enough with the constraints that it's like way easier for me. Like if I'm spinning something up, I'll just do it in an X anyway. But yeah, there are cases where you might not want those constraints. But if you're somewhere with a big team, it might take a beat, but you will get like better productivity once you have everything in place and everyone, coding the same, right? So
Cool.
very cool. Well, thank you, everyone. How do you want to handle grabbing a randomized 3 people?
It's totally up to you, Michael.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just grab. Let me see, 3 people at random. How do we usually get the information from these people? Because they're just like usernames and.
The way I always recommend is just have people DM you on Twitter or send you an email. You already gave out your work email. You could use that.
Mhm.
And it's just the policy of if you don't end up communicating, there's no way you can redeem your prize. So.
Okay, so I just threw up I misspelt it. I misspelt my name. That's not my Twitter, guys. Don't use that.
Also, make sure you send it to all panelists and all attendees.
Did I not do that? I think it's, 2. I don't know how I got just on Lawrence. So Lawrence, that's not my Twitter. If you can use my email that I put up above, but let's see. I'm gonna just grab 3 people at random. We'll have a more defined way to do this in the future.
What's the prize? What are we getting?
There are 3 tickets to Reliable Web Summit.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And when is that?
Is that August, Eric?
I think like the last week of August.
You had a slide on it.
I had a slide on them.
August 26th and 27th of this year.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
That'd
be cool.
The speaker lineup on that seems really exciting.
Okay, so I'm sorry if I butcher anyone's names, but let's say Hosen, Hosseen. If you can message me, and let's do trying to grab random people.
Brian Love, congratulations.
Brian Love and Eric Slack.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Brian's probably already speaking.
How about that? Whoa.
Let's do what is this? Diva Balan. Again, I'm sorry if I messed this up. So DEVA space BALAN.
How are you choosing this at random?
I'm just scrolling and like hovering, and there's someone. This is all I got. I don't have a hat with names in it. Well, it's hard because you want to use the people at the end. If you write them all at the beginning, you have people drop off at the end.
Well, in the America's English series, we have a Kahoot game, and you compete for prize. And we might do the same thing with here. It's up to Michael and Duncan, but that takes a lot more preparation. So this being our first event, we weren't even expecting to have prizes, and then everyone was like, "Hey guys, we got stuff for you."
Okay. For the third one, let's do Tori, Tory. So that's 3. Hosen, Diva, and Tori. So if you email me or message me on Twitter, that I will take care of that.
Congrats.
Did you write down who you gave the prizes?
I wrote them down on this paper, so I will just look for email and message from those people.
And if they don't message you, then I claim the prize. No, I'm kidding. Hit Michael up, even if you didn't get chosen today, because he might be looking for runner-ups who didn't contact him.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so that works. Everyone follow me on Twitter now. Okay, well, thank you guys. We will do this again next month, and like I said, we have Manfred.
You said Manfred, yeah.
And
it's Michael Dowden, also Angular or Firebase GDE and CEO of Andromeda Galactic Solutions. So it goes right along with the enterprise document.
Yeah, there we
That's
go.
awesome.
That's
Nice.
great.
Good company.
And his
name.
name's Michael. I'm just throwing that out there.
Drew. All right.